Well, let's come back together. And so, in response to all that we just saw at the end of verse 7, now things start to even continue to progress. We see that Mordecai is going to receive a promotion. And this is going to be an important step for him in verse 7. King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he stretched out his hands against the Jews." So this is a promotion for the Mordecai, and with regards to Esther as well. Not that she's promoted, but Mordecai uh, is going to be promoted. This is going to then precipitate. Mordecai is going to be involved in this decree that's going to come from the Persian king. And this decree in verses 11 through 13, we see he's not going to revoke the decree that was previously issued, but what he can do is issue a secondary decree. So, verse 10, "And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses riding on the steeds sired by the royal stud. And them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil." Sounds pretty intense, coming from a Persian king. "On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar." So you see the political ramifications of this. Verses 15 through 16, Mordecai gets to work. "Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes, blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen, purple." All of the things that Haman wanted, of course. "And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was a light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province and in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jew, a feast and a holy day and a holiday. And many among the people of the land became Jews, for the fear or dread of the Jews had fallen on them." There's a lot going on here. It's interesting, the joy that we see in this text as the Jews are responding as this new decree is making it around to the 127 Persian provinces, one of which is where Zerubbabel and Ezra and now Nehemiah is serving as governor by this time, back in Jerusalem. And this whole event, this whole Mordecai precipitated event is interesting. It's having almost, I would say, an evangelistic effect. You see that in verse 17. The peoples of the land became Jews. Now, I don't want to overstate it. Again, it seems to suggest that just like what we saw with Rahab, before the Jews would get to Jericho, Rahab has already read the headlines a few days. She remembers the historical events coming out of Egypt. Apparently, it was commonly well known. Oh yeah, we know your God. We know of his reputation, his name. He's the one who, wins the battles for you. So, I get it. So, here's my white flag, And so it's interesting that may have been happening now that here once again, look at this. The God of the Jews. Remember Mordecai the Jew? He's not just anybody. That's his God, because of who he is. So this is the reputation of the God of the Jews. I think subtly coming in here and actually making an impact on people who are watching this all take place. You can't, I think the Jews in these provinces would have been certainly responding once this first edict came down, right? There are people around who are just like Haman and all these other provinces. I think that if we turn to the next slide, you'll see where I'm going with this. This is the new edict. And I think chapter 9, verse 1, this edict now starts to have traction. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so that the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. So now we've got other Hamans around. And I think the Jews, don't you think, in those provinces would have known who the Hamans were? So they're like, now they've been equipped and allowed to have their own posses in the old Wild Wild West kind of idea. So those who hated the Jews now will become, their plot will take the same road as Haman, I think is what's going on here. But then there's other people around who are not Jew haters. They're not hating the Jews. They've been cohabitating with the Jews and have been watching from across the fence for some time. And then they're starting to see what just happened. This edict now, and now you've got political involvement going on in supporting the Jews and allowing them to defend themselves against the people around the corner here. We've known for some time that they've hated Jews. So you've got this total... this really probably shook up a lot of the what was going on in these provinces. Verse 3, there's the political involvement. You see, even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, and the governors, and those who were doing the king's business, assisted the Jews because of the fear or dread of Mordecai had fallen on them. So Mordecai, his name and reputation now is going before him with regards to the local Persian authorities. All right, so you can look at that. It's just interesting, the dominoes that start to fall. So finally, we have the details of the event merge into a feast, and we have more information here given in chapter 9 on the Feast of Purim, and details about how this event would be remembered. Chapter 9, verse 28. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth. And you see that Mordecai becomes the hero of the story here at the very end, chapter 10. King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, with the full account of the greatness of Mordecai to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book, according to the author? Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with the multitude of his kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare of the whole nation. So the tribute to King, but also to Mordecai, is how this book ends. Kind of reminds us of the fitting tribute when we put the capstone on the Pentateuch, that last little chapter, and Moses dies, but he's remembered, and kind of the tribute idea. So, well, let's finish the book of Esther, and we move on to our last set of books, the book of Chronicles. Yes, sir?
How does this decree fit in with the timeline of all the other ones? Like, is this just for the Jews near, like, the capital, or is this also for the Jews that have already gone out?
All the provinces.
All the provinces?
Yeah, this was a huge decree. It was sent out with regards to all 127. Yeah.
How does this then fit in with when the temple rebuilding was stopped because of a decree saying that they should stop?
By this time, remember, let's see, Esther, I could pull that timeline slide up. The book of Esther fits, I'll show you. See if I can find it here. After the temple rebuilding, Zerubbabel, Then we have Ezra. Let's see, we have that 50-year period in between, and then I'm sorry, after Zerubbabel, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. So this is, let's see, fitting in. See if I can pull this up. No, it's not really helpful, is it? I don't even list Esther right here. Right before the time Ezra is going to go to Jerusalem, right before the 458. So there's that.
30?
Pardon?
Is it 483, 473 that Esther's? I copied yours.
Yeah, you gave us a timeline with it.
That timeline, yeah, that little time period in between there. So in that window of time is what I was trying to remember with precision. But yeah, that's when we were talking about before Ezra.
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're kind of in the same time period.
Mm-hmm. Xerxes during that time period right there. Yeah. Yeah, before. Yeah, right. It seems like there's just a series of decrees that are happening, going all the way back to Daniel and the decree, Darius's decree. These decrees coming from Persia, favorable in different ways. That this is just another example, I'd say, this decree of the reversal decree, you might say, like the one from Darius and like the one from Cyrus. It's going to allow them to go back and rebuild and all those things. So
basically just the different kings just kind of made different decrees for whatever really was going on at that time. So they can just reverse the old creed.
Right.
Okay.
That's what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
With Ahasuerus. Maybe check that slide to make sure this is still visible, that I didn't mess something up. All right. Well, let's move to Chronicles. And are we okay? Good. All right. Chronicles. Now, just a little word at this point before we get into our discussion of Chronicles, just as a way of reminder. This week, I'm going to send out my own decree, the study guide for the final exam I'll have ready for you this week. So I'll email that out or post it and make sure you get it. And next week, we'll probably just spend time, it depends on how far I get. We may have a little bit of time to finish up Chronicles, but then the rest of the time I'll spend kind of walking through a little bit of a review and remind us all of the kind of the high points along the way for this semester that I'd like us to go back and review and have ready for the final. So we'll do that next week. Just wanted to make sure everybody knew that. Now, Chronicles. I don't know what your all's experience has been with the book of Chronicles, whether you've heard preaching from the book of Chronicles or if you've had any exposure to Chronicles in terms of, any Bible college courses that you've taken or anything. Oftentimes, in my experience, Chronicles is kind of skimped over a little bit. A professor will get to the end of the semester and run out of time. Spent way too much time on the Pentateuch and maybe talking about documentary hypothesis and all this stuff, and they run out of steam at the end of the semester and don't have a lot to say about Chronicles. And typically what is said is, well, it just repeats the history of Samuel King, so that's all you need to know about Chronicles. Well, I hope you see what I've done here in terms of helping us approach the book of Chronicles. I'm going to have a little time today and a little bit next week, I think, to talk about Chronicles because it's an interesting book, more that it just kind of looks back, and the vantage point of the chronicler is, we'll call him the chronicler, the author of Chronicles. He's a historian. Like we talked about the the historian or the author of Samuel Kings, or the authors who were operating to get that historical people, places, things, and events down. But we talked about a different audience. Here's what I want us to remember, that the audiences are now have changed. So you've got the exilic audience, the audience that's in Babylon for that 70-year period. I think it's safe to say Samuel Kings is really addressed to that group. The author of Kings is going to finish that history, but he's also going to evaluate it theologically. And remember, the author of Kings, who's evaluating Kings, starting with the United Kingdom for that 120-year period, Saul, David, and Solomon, but then the divided kingdom for that 400-year period. And all of the kings that were evaluated, 0 are evaluated positively in Israel, and maybe 8 at the most are evaluated positively in Judah after the divided kingdom. So this is a different approach to that same history. The author of Chronicles is now addressing a different audience. This is the audience. His audience is the audience that's come back from exile. His audience is the one that's come back under Zerubbabel, under Ezra, under Nehemiah. His audience is the one that left and took that long trek. Do you remember that trek of faith? From the equivalent of walking from Indianapolis to Dallas, Texas. Taking that long journey back to the Promised Land to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city, the walls around Jerusalem, and more importantly, a covenant community. This is the audience that's being addressed by the author of Chronicles. So this is the post-exilic audience. Now what's tricky about the book of Chronicles is that this historian, the chronicler, he's going to demonstrate, and we'll see it along the way, he's going to be selective. He has source material that's already written down, maybe a little library. He's going to have access to Samuel and Kings and some other source material. He's going to be charged to put down and evaluate theologically this history that's already taken place, but he's addressing the audience that's in this post-exilic time. And this is a group of people who have a different vantage point, a different maybe perspective on how to look at things and what kind of needs they have. The kind of needs, that things that they need to be reminded of is different than the group who were in that 70-year exilic period. So that's kind of the big idea of Chronicles is, there's a lot less bad news, a lot less negative, critical kind of evaluation that we see in Chronicles, and some of the theological or faith high points of that historical period will be not only brought in but expanded. That's the writing project of the chronicler. So, in most, it's hard. The tricky thing is when you're reading Chronicles is to know, is this a repetition of what I've read in Samuel Kings? Or is there something that the author left out? Or is this additional material that's included by the author of Chronicles that I didn't read in Samuel Kings before? It's one of those three. And it's interesting, that activity of knowing, am I reading something repeated? Am I reading something omitted? Although you wouldn't read it because it's been left out intentionally. Or is this new information or new material that the author of Chronicles has added because he wants to bring in more information and more emphasis for this? And that's the thing that's tricky about Chronicles. And most people don't read Chronicles that way. And, that's the challenge. But it's there where you get your theological, I think, and I'll try to introduce you, I think, to some of those theological high points, and of all places, the book of Chronicles, because of the very strategy of the author. So it's kind of a subtle thing, but for you Bible experts, you can read Chronicles at a slightly higher level. And there's ways of getting at that information. If you've got one of those study Bibles that gives you the parallel margin, for example, where it shows you cross-references, that's one place you can always see, am I reading something in Samuel that's parallel to this text? Am I reading something that's, oh, look, there's no parallel to Samuel Kings. That means it must be new information. Or, oh, it's a repetition. Or, that's one way to crack that one. So let's get into it. I think the big idea in Chronicles, as you've heard me repeat over and over and over, is just how Chronicles ends. There's the theological thesis statement of the author of Chronicles. Like the book of Judges, the thesis statement's in the very last verse. And that part of the Cyrus decree that we see, the author of Chronicles just cuts it right in half. He doesn't even give us the full Cyrus decree. That's an example of the author being selective, emphatically selective, I'd say. And the word is the Hebrew word, let him go up. There's the, I would, as you'll hear me argue, the eschatological thesis statement of the author of Chronicles. He's got his eye to the future. And he's helping his audience, this group that's come back, focus on the future. And it's going to be throughout the whole book. And most of this gets overlooked because we're just thinking that's just a repeated history. So we don't even read it. But it's interesting because of what he includes, what he expands, and what he doesn't include, we see that focus on the future in the book of Chronicles even become more emphatic. So I'll show you along the way. That's my little strategy as we keep going. And we read, our very last word in our English Bible, in our canon, is the book of Revelation. I just want to say this one more time, but it shouldn't surprise us that the author of the New Testament book of Revelation, John, he who testifies to these things says, yes, I'm coming quickly. And what do we say? Amen? Come, Lord Jesus. Come quickly. That's the connection to the old and new, right? We see, let him go up. Maybe that's a reference to the king who's coming. Maybe that's the invitation. Let him come up. Where's he going? Well, he's going up to his throne. Where's that? It's Zion. It's the Jerusalem. It's where the throne's coming down, and that's where the king's going to sit. And when he comes and sits on that throne, everything else is going to fall into place. So that's what we're doing. We're going to that place because that's where all the action's going to take place. That might be an emphasis that the author of Chronicles is doing here. He's got his prophet hat on, and he's been given some information, like the prophets before him, who were talking about this day of the Lord, and he's saying, "Oh, yeah, I'm gonna emphasize that with the very last word in my book, my history book," and that ends up being the very last word in the Hebrew canon. Interestingly, I just throw this out. I can't prove it, but if Jesus was having his quiet time with his disciples, the morning before he enters Jerusalem, what if he had it in Chronicles, chapter 36? Let him go up. Jesus turns to his disciples and says, guys, today we're going up. This is going to be my first round, but I'll be coming back again to go up too, but you'll have to wait for that. But today we're going up. Riding on a donkey, of course, but it's just interesting. That was the last word in the Bible that he and all of the disciples would have read, as well as Paul and all the authors of the New Testament. So this idea of going up is kind of important. But it's eschatological, and it's pointing to the future, this idea of going up. So it's going to come to us in 3 parts. And it's really a radical departure from Samuel King's in terms of how it starts and how it ends and all of that, everything in between. So it starts, interestingly, in creation, or at least with Adam, in terms of the genealogy. And the genealogy from 1 Chronicles chapter 1 all the way through chapter 9 ends up with the chronology that goes all the way from restoration, from Adam to the restoration from Babylon. In other words, to the return. Cyrus's decree, really. And then we're going to have a middle section, kind of like a Big Mac sandwich. 1 Chronicles chapter 10 all the way through 2 Chronicles. Remember, we're talking about one book originally. Chapter 9 is going to focus on David and Solomon. And then the bottom part of the sandwich, 2 Chronicles chapter 10 all the way to the end, is now going to give us the historical period from Rehoboam, really the divided kingdom, to the restoration from Babylon, Cyrus' decree and return. So that's kind of the three-part strategy of the entire corpus, First and Second Chronicles. All right? So the significance on just that alone, you see that this is the audience that's been given, this is this group that's come back under the restoration from Babylon. The fact that the author is focusing on them shows up in the organizational structure of the whole historical collection, Chronicles, First and Second Chronicles, thinking of it as one book now. You see that information. When they read Chronicles now, you see how they're going to be encouraged. Oh, I get it, reader of Chronicles, post-exilic community of faith. I see that God's plan from the very beginning, I'm part of that. I have a future and a hope. The author of Chronicles is reminding me that my future and hope in terms of what's history ahead for me goes all the way back to God's creating the cosmos and for the first human, Adam. My genealogy traces to him, so I have a future and a hope. Do you see where that encouragement would come? All right. So 9 chapters of genealogy. And here it's interesting, all the 12 tribes of Israel now find their heritage in the genealogy that we have in chapters 1 through 9. From creation to the 12 tribes. And it's interesting that these tribes would see that the new creation, what God has planned for the future, they're involved in that. So it's written into the very fabric of the genealogies and how the genealogies here, as they're organized, lay out this emphasis. From the very initial creation of the whole world, the 12 tribes will find their roots and their foundation in that divine activity. So from Adam, we see from the very beginning, to Seth. See, his readers would have known how to fill in the blanks to these stories. So it's not just genealogy for them. As they're reading it, they have a whole history behind a name. They're familiar with their Old Testament, the writings, the books of Moses that tell the patriarchal history. All they have to do is see a name, and as it relates, their history is attached to that name, to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, all the way up through, so that it's not just genealogy for this audience, that this group of returnees, they see themselves in this history and recognize that. All right, so, and the family names as well, we'll see the family names, the household names are all also connected to this strategy, the genealogical strategy of the author of Chronicles. Let's jump over to chapter 9 at the very end here of the genealogical section. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. So here's what the author says, chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. So all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel, and Judah was carried away into exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Verse 2. Now the first who lived in their positions in their cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. So this is all the way into present history for the author of Chronicles. And all the way up to the exile. So what we have going on here, the author of Chronicles is saying, those who came out of exile, you who are here, you priests, you're the ones who are legitimate, right? All of us who will be worshiping in this place, and you priests who will be serving in the temple as we move forward. I think that this author of Chronicles is saying that we've got the temple now, but there's one that's going to be coming again when the king comes. So all of this is to legitimize what they're presently doing at the time of the writing of the author, as well as this eschatological pointing ahead to the future. I think we've kind of got both things going on here. The author of Chronicles, let's turn to Haggai chapter 2. Might probably sound a little bit like the prophet, one of the prophets who was raised up by God to encourage this group, the same group, right? This kind of encouragement that they'd need. Haggai chapter 2. Let's have Calvin, why don't you read for us? Do you have that? Haggai chapter 2. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Right there at the end. Chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, yes.
In the second year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month.
Oh, Haggai. I'm sorry. Haggai chapter 2?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Keep reading, I'm sorry.
Came the word of the Lord, came the word through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, Shealtiel, governor of Judah, to Joshua son of Josiah, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it now seem to you like nothing? But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, Joshua, son of Josiah, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the Lord of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt. And my spirit remains among you. Do not fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says. In a little while I will come once more, shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty.
Okay, so there you see, and we may have talked about this before, but the latter glory will be greater than the former glory. You see the emphasis here in the prophet Haggai. You've got this group, they're standing around, they've been having church for a while, and they're a little, maybe discouraged. This temple is not anything like Solomon's temple, and the prophet Haggai has this eschatological word, right? The latter will be greater than the former. You see that there in verse 9. So that's encouragement. That's that future encouragement. I think that same kind of prophetic focus on the future is what we have with the author of Chronicles. So let's go back to 1 Chronicles and pick out a few things in the genealogical text. In chapter 2, you see some things that start to show up that reflect the chronicler's interests in terms of how, or the ordering of the genealogy and the naming of the sons. And the order here in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. These are the sons of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The order: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Reuben's listed first, but the expansion of the genealogy that we'll see places greater emphasis not on an expansion of Reuben, but the expansion on Judah. Judah's going to be put first on the list in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 3. Then or there we see the sons of Judah. Now he's elevated to first, and his genealogy takes first place there. All the way through chapter 4, verse 23, we'll continue to focus on the ongoing expansion of the genealogy of Judah. And this is going to line up with Numbers chapter 2, Numbers chapter 7, and some of the genealogies that we saw earlier in the Pentateuch. Chronicles, the list that we see here in the genealogies of Chronicles is probably going to line up closest with the list that we see in Genesis 46 and also Numbers chapter 26. So all that to say, broadly speaking, the chronicler appears to freely choose from the variety of the genealogical lists that we have in the Bible, the older lists, but all roads of emphasis lead to basically three areas with his genealogy: the priority of Judah, the inclusion of Levi, and a broadened, you might say, profile for Benjamin. So that's what we have here. This emphasis, the priority of Judah. I think the chronicler here is picking up. We read at the beginning of this morning, Genesis 3:15, and he who will come from the line of Judah. So the role of the Messiah who's coming. I think we see the priority of Judah intentional with the author of Chronicles for that reason. The inclusion of Levi will have to do with the Levitical priests who will have a role to play when that king comes and establishes his throne, his temple, and his kingdom. So a little bit of an eschatological thing coming in with the anticipation of the king who's coming. So the Messiah, he's coming from the line of Judah, and the Levitical priests will have a role to play in that new throne, that new temple that's coming. And you see in chapter 6, in the genealogy there, the genealogy of the priestly line, verses 1 through 5 there. The Levitical priests will trace their lineage back to Moses and then to Aaron there in chapter 6, verse 1 through 5. And then finally we end the genealogy in chapter 9, verse 2, with those who returned from exile. So now the first who lived in their possessions, in their cities, were Israel. You'll see that the chronicler will also refer to all Israel. There's going to be a downplaying that the chronicler has on referring to Israel and Judah, north and south. He's going to want to prefer to refer to all Israel. It's referring to really another way of putting emphasis on what is our future reality going to be. Are we going to be a divided kingdom when the king comes back? No. We're going to be Israel and Judah will be restored into one nation, Israel, again. So I think that's a little bit of a... and if we think of the group that's come back, they're legitimized. They need to be encouraged to see that the fact that they look back in history, we're coming from that history, all the way back to creation, through the patriarchal, through the kings in that godly line, all the way through David and Solomon and the covenants that God promised. We're part of that history, and that's what the chronicler is trying to do in terms of bringing this all together for this audience that's come back. All right, and let's see here. Move on to another goofy picture. Past the genealogies, now we move past the genealogies. Now we get into a really good example of the selectivity of the author who's at work here. The second section here begins in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1, all the way through 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 31. This is the section, or the middle section, that's going to focus on David and Solomon. All right? Now, here's what it looks like. In Samuel, you remember how much or how many chapters were included and focused on Saul? quite a few, right? We started Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 9. Really, Saul continues all the way through the end of the book of 1 Samuel to chapter 31. And according to the historian, Saul is interwoven throughout the life of King David. In the chronicler, it's striking. One chapter to Saul. One. That's it. That's all that he wants to say about Saul. And you see it in chapter 9 there. And that's it. The evaluation there in verse 13. Well, let's see here. Do I want to say that? Yeah, 22 chapters in Samuel includes Saul, but the chronicler, there's just one chapter dedicated to his first king. If we think of this principle of selectivity, and we see that the chronicler in his genealogy goes all the way back to Adam. So really, it goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Other significant things that the chronicler could have included in history, he chooses not to. There's no account of the Exodus from Egypt. There's no mention of Sinai, Mount Sinai, according to the chronicler. Moses is the central figure of the Pentateuch, is barely even mentioned, only in the genealogies of Levi in 1 Chronicles chapter 6, verse 3. And again in chapter 23, we see a reference to Moses. So he's beginning his history with creation, but his genealogy transcends the entire history of Israel all the way up to the post-exilic period. So he chooses his material that he chooses to include very intentionally. We call this theological selectivity. And this is part of the question we ask ourselves. So to be true to the message of the chronicler, we want to try to, as best we can, understand what are we call these biases, not in a negative way, but what are his theological tendencies? And from that, we want to understand, it helps us to better understand his intentions in the meaning of the book. So let's look at a few more of these. Saul's left out of the history of the chronicler for the most part. So that's the picture of being left out. In fact, the chronicler jumps from 1 Samuel chapter 9. He basically skips right up to the very last chapter, for chapter 31, as the source material for the chronicler's chapter 10. And this is the chapter, if you remember, chapter 31 in Samuel's where Saul dies on the battlefield. So he goes very quickly to Saul's death and gives an account of that. And in verse 13, here's what I wanted to look at the very end of chapter 10 in 1 Chronicles, we see his assessment of Saul. Verse 13 and 14. So Saul died for his trespass, which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. All right. So that's the idea there of Saul being, or not keeping the word, or the idea of being unfaithful is a common assessment word or description word of the chronicler. This one was unfaithful. This person was unfaithful. So the idea of him using this idea of unfaithfulness, we'll see that as a common thread throughout the history of the chronicler, which would have been an important thing for the exiles who have come back. What are the consequences of being unfaithful? What are we supposed to learn from these who have gone before us, who have demonstrated unfaithfulness? And how does God respond to their unfaithfulness? We want to be faithful. That's the encouragement of the chronicler. The chronicler in chapter 5 First Chronicles chapter 5. I want to go back there and kind of see where this shows up again. Oh, there we go. Let's see. There's the First Chronicles chapter 5, verse 25, on his evaluation of Manasseh, for example. But they acted treacherously against the God of their fathers and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land whom God had destroyed before them. So God of Assyria, the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, even the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away into exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them to Halah, Havor, Harah, and to the river of Gozan to this day. All right. So the reminder there of the chronicler is, very brief there, but it's how God responded in history to the unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel. That's what we see there. All right, so let's keep going here. Actually, let's take a little break here before we get started with the text that focuses on King David. So let's take another 5-minute break, 6-minute break, and we'll come back.